There is a strange kind of loneliness that only certain people understand. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the quiet, confusing feeling of living in a world that seems to have moved forward without fully taking you with it. If you were born somewhere between 1976 and 1985, you may recognize this feeling instantly. You remember a childhood that felt slower, quieter, almost sacred in its simplicity. A time when boredom existed, and strangely, boredom wasn't something to escape. It was something that created imagination. You remember calling your friends on a landline, stretching the cord across the hallway so your parents wouldn't hear your conversations. You remember waiting all week for a television show, not because you loved waiting, but because waiting was simply how life worked. Life had friction back then, and friction, strangely enough, gave moments their weight. But then something unusual happened while you were growing up. The world didn't just change, it accelerated. The shift wasn't gradual. It was like standing on solid ground, and suddenly discovering the ground had turned into a moving walkway. Computers entered homes, the internet quietly appeared. Phones became smaller, smarter, and eventually became the center of human attention, and somewhere in that transition, you became something society rarely talks about. A bridge, not quite part of Generation X. The generation raised almost entirely in the analog world, and not fully part of the millennials, the generation raised inside the digital one. You became something in between, what some people now call a Xennial. But bridges carry a peculiar psychological burden. They hold two worlds together while belonging completely to neither. You remember the silence before constant connection, but you were young enough to adapt to the noise that came after it. You learned patience in childhood, but speed became the currency of adulthood. And this quiet contradiction shaped the emotional architecture of your mind. Because the human brain isn't just built from experiences, it's built from the pace of those experiences. Children raised in slower environments develop one rhythm of attention, emotion, and identity. But when the world suddenly speeds up during adolescence and early adulthood, the nervous system struggles to recalibrate. Psychologists sometimes call this temporal dissonance. It's the strange psychological tension that happens when the world you were trained for no longer exists. Imagine spending years learning to sail a wooden boat across calm waters. You study the winds, the tides, the slow patience required to navigate the sea. But the moment you finally leave the harbor, the ocean is turned into a highway of speedboats. Everyone is moving faster than you expected, and suddenly, the rules have changed. That quiet tension lives inside many Xennials today. A subtle sense that life somehow sped up faster than the soul could follow. But the deeper psychology goes even further back. Because the late 80s and early 90s were also an emotional crossroads in family culture. Many Xennials were raised in households shaped by a generation that believed emotional endurance was a virtue. Parents who had been taught to work hard, stay strong, and move forward without always discussing feelings. Love existed, of course, but emotional language was often limited. Many children learned early how to read moods instead of hearing explanations, to interpret silence instead of open conversation, to sense tension in the room, the way animals sense shifts in weather. These are what psychologists sometimes call micro-traumas, not dramatic events, not obvious harm, but small, repeated moments where emotional needs were quietly misunderstood, minimized, or simply left unspoken. A child asks for attention and hears "not now." A child feels sadness and is told "you're fine." A child struggles and is told "be strong." Individually, these moments seem harmless, but over years they carve subtle patterns into the emotional landscape of the mind. Patterns that whisper messages like, "Don't be too needy. Don't make problems bigger than they are. Handle things yourself." So many Xennials grew into adults who appear incredibly independent, but privately carry a quiet difficulty asking for support. Not because they don't need it, but because somewhere early in life the emotional system learned that needing too much might make things uncomfortable for others. And then the digital world arrived. A world that suddenly demanded constant visibility, social media profiles, professional branding, personal updates, a culture where everyone seemed to be displaying their life like a highlight reel. For someone raised to quietly manage emotions, this new environment created an invisible psychological conflict. Inside, you may still carry the instinct to process things privately, slowly, internally, but outside, the world rewards those who constantly share, perform, and present themselves. It's like being asked to speak loudly in a language your heart learned to whisper. And that conflict often shows up as a subtle but persistent exhaustion, not just physical exhaustion, but emotional fatigue, because the mind is constantly translating between two different emotional systems. The slower, quieter inner world you were raised in, and the faster, louder world that adulthood demanded you enter. This is why many Xennials describe feeling strangely out of sync with modern culture, too young to fully disconnect from it. Too old to feel native inside it. You remember what life felt like before the internet rewired attention itself. You remember when friendships developed over years instead of being maintained through constant digital contact. You remember privacy not as something rare, but as something normal. And yet today, the modern world feels like an endless stream of information, opinions, comparisons, and expectations. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as ambient stress. Stress that doesn't come from one big crisis, but from thousands of tiny signals constantly competing for attention. Notifications, emails, messages, deadlines, updates. It's like trying to rest beside a river that never stops rushing. And for a generation that remembers when the water used to move slowly, the difference can feel overwhelming. But perhaps the most complicated psychological experience of Xennials is something far more subtle. It's a type of grief that rarely gets recognized. A grief for a world that quietly disappeared while you were growing up. Not a tragic loss, but an ambiguous loss. The disappearance of slower time. The disappearance of slower time. The disappearance of boredom. The disappearance of childhood spaces untouched by digital surveillance. The disappearance of the quiet gaps where identity once had room to grow naturally. Those spaces were replaced with speed, efficiency, optimization, and endless comparison. So many Xennials adapted. They learned the technology. They built careers in industries that didn't even exist during their childhood. They became translators between analog and digital life. But adaptation comes with a hidden cost. When the environment keeps changing, the mind learns something subtle. Never get too comfortable. Stay ready to adjust. Stay ready to pivot. Stay ready for the next update. And over time, this creates what we might call permanent adaptation mode, a psychological state where the brain is always preparing for change even when nothing urgent is happening. The nervous system never fully settles, and this is why so many Xennials carry a quiet contradiction inside them. They crave stability more than most. Generations, yet they struggle to believe stability will actually last. But what most people misunderstand about this generation is that this tension, this feeling of being between two worlds, is not simply a weakness. It's actually the beginning of something far more powerful. Because people who grow up during transitions develop a rare ability. They see things others take for granted. They remember what existed before, and that memory quietly changes how they understand the present. But that realization, that shift in perspective, doesn't happen immediately. In fact, for many Xennials, it only begins when a deeper question slowly emerges in adulthood. A question that often arrives late at night, in quiet moments between responsibilities, when the noise of the world briefly fades. The question sounds simple, but it carries enormous weight. Did I adapt to the future? Or did I slowly lose parts of myself trying to survive it? And the answer to that question may change everything about how this generation understands its place in the world. Because hidden inside that realization is the beginning of a completely different way of seeing the life you've lived so far and the life that still waits ahead, and the life that still waits ahead. Because that question, did I adapt to the future, or did I slowly lose parts of myself trying to survive it, is where the psychology of the Xennial generation begins to turn. At first, the realization can feel unsettling. You begin to notice how often your life has been about adjusting. New technologies, new work cultures, new expectations. It's as if every decade handed you a new map, but never gave you time to study it before the roads changed again. And somewhere along the way, many Xennials developed a quiet reflex. The reflex to keep moving, to keep learning, to keep upgrading, to keep upgrading, to keep proving that they can. Still keep up. From the outside, this looks like resilience, but from the inside, it sometimes feels like living on shifting sand, because resilience without rest slowly becomes exhaustion. This is why so many Xennials reach a moment in adulthood where the old strategies stop working. The endless adaptation, the silent endurance, the ability to handle everything alone, the nervous system begins to whisper something important. Maybe survival is no longer the goal. Maybe the goal is something softer, something deeper. Maybe the goal is finally learning how to belong inside your own life. And that shift begins with a quiet reframing. What if the years you spent between two worlds weren't a disadvantage, but a rare form of vision? After all, people who only grow up in one era rarely question it. They inherit the rules of their time and assume those rules are permanent. But Xennials saw the rules change. You witnessed how quickly certainty can dissolve, how entire industries can vanish, how communication itself can transform within a single decade. That experience does something powerful to the mind. It breaks the illusion that the current way of living is the only way. And once that illusion breaks, something unexpected becomes possible. Choice. You begin to realize that not every cultural expectation deserves your obedience. You don't have to live at the speed the world demands. You don't have to measure your worth by digital attention. You don't have to perform your identity for invisible audiences. You are allowed to reclaim pieces of the slower world you remember. Small pieces at first, a quiet walk without your phone, a conversation without multitasking, an evening where boredom is not treated like a problem that needs fixing. These moments might seem insignificant, but psychologically, they rebuild something that modern life slowly erodes. Inner continuity, the sense that your mind is not constantly being pulled in 1,000 directions, but allowed to return to itself, and when that continuity returns, another realization begins to form. The bridge you thought you were trapped on may actually be a vantage point, because people who have lived through transitions often develop a deeper kind of wisdom. You understand technology without worshiping it. You understand nostalgia without living inside it. You understand ambition, but you also understand the cost of chasing it endlessly. You know what life felt like when time moved slower, and that memory becomes something precious. Not because the past was perfect, but because it reminds you that human life has always needed space to breathe. And maybe that is the quiet role the Xennial generation was meant to play. Not the fastest generation, not the loudest generation, but the generation that remembers, the generation that can look at the accelerating world and ask a simple, almost rebellious question: is faster actually better? Because when a culture forgets how to pause, the people who remember stillness become its teachers. And perhaps that is why so many Xennials eventually discover a new kind of strength in midlife. They stop trying to outrun time. Instead, they begin choosing where their time actually belongs. Less noise, more meaning, less comparison, more presence, less performance, more authenticity. And slowly, the exhaustion that once felt like a personal failure begins to transform into something else. Clarity. You realize that feeling out of sync with the modern world was never a sign that you were broken. It was a sign that you were awake to changes others never noticed. You were witnessing the emotional cost of a world that moved faster than the human heart was designed for. And now, with that awareness, you are free to live differently, not perfectly, not completely detached from modern life, but more consciously, more deliberately, more human. Because the truth is, the bridge generation was never meant to choose one world over the other. It was meant to carry the wisdom of both, to remember the quiet past while shaping a more thoughtful future. And if you have ever felt like you didn't fully belong in the world that grew around you, maybe that feeling was never meant to isolate you. Maybe it was meant to guide you toward a life that moves at the speed of your own soul. So if something in this story felt familiar, if it felt like someone quietly describing thoughts you've never put into words, then know this. You are not strange for feeling caught between worlds. You are simply someone who remembers what both worlds look like. And that memory might be exactly what the future needs. If this story resonated with you, then somewhere out there, another quiet bridge walker probably felt the same thing while listening. And if you'd like more reflections like this, slow thoughts about the strange psychology of modern life, Consider staying a little longer, because sometimes the most important realizations arrive quietly in the spaces where we finally allow ourselves to think.